Welcome to today's edition of the Journal Live. I'm Chris Green, the executive editor of the Journal, the civic issues magazine published by the Kansas Leadership Center. When Sheila Albers couldn't get the answers to the questions she had after her 17-year-old son was shot and killed by police while he was in the midst of a mental health crisis, she didn't give up. Instead, she kept pushing, using open records laws to unearth information that shed new light on aspects of the case, and ended up mobilizing residents to help change the ways that Overland Park responded to incidents involving people facing mental health challenges. Albers was neither a journalist nor an open records expert when she began her quest. But while her story shows how everyday people can leverage public records to foster change, such efforts remain pretty uncommon in Kansas. Why don't more Kansans use open records to influence the direction of their communities? What do Kansans need to know about using them? What challenges do they create for local governments in terms of responding to these requests? And what do all Kansans need to know about navigating the system? It can often be confusing if you are not a professional who works in it a lot of the time. We're going to address many of these questions today, and joining me is a panel that features Sheila Albers, the mother of John Albers, Pilar Pedraza, a senior political reporter at KAKE News, Mark Schmidt, a retired attorney who helped spearhead Sheila's work around transparency, Mike Sherry, the Journal contributor who brought us this story, Todd Fettig, executive director of the National Freedom of Information Coalition, and Dave Traber, the chief executive officer of the Kansas Policy Institute, is also here with us. I would like to, starting with Sheila, just get a chance to give you all a bit of an opportunity to introduce yourselves in a little more detail. And I'm interested in starting with Sheila, like what would you like to see come out of this conversation? Or what's the most important thing you hope kind of emerges from our hour together this afternoon?
There we go. The thing I hope comes out of this entire conversation is that more people use open records to influence change, that open records requests are not just for journalists and attorneys. We all have the ability to get information, and with that information, we can push for change. That is my big hope.
What about you, Pilar?
She's muted.
Yep. We are just, that's a contagion today. Maybe
there we go. Might help if I unmuted. Sorry about that. I would kind of ditto what Sheila said. One central theme of my entire career has been getting people the basic information that they need to lead their best lives. And oftentimes that comes down to knowing how to access that information as much as anything. There was one point in my career when I was actually a high school teacher, and they asked me to take over the journalism classes because I was also a journalist. And I ended up getting into a huge First Amendment fight with the district, and it all started with me teaching the students how to do public records requests. And it's just, there's not enough knowledge out there right now.
And Mike Sherry, you're the one who brought us this story. I get the sense from some of our conversations, this is an issue you also have some strong insights on as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I would echo really what the Pilar and Sheila said. I mean, in that I hope that people will walk away with some strategies, basically, about how to access it, not to be put off by it or intimidated by using the open records law. So hopefully they will have some, by learning what Sheila did, she can lead by example and say it can be intimidating, but she learned as she went.
And Mark, could you share a little bit more about your role in this story and what you hope the audience will get out of this today?
Sure. Well, after John was shot, there was a pretty significant period of time between the district attorney's decision not to charge Officer Jennison and ultimately Sheila filing a lawsuit. And during that time, I began trying to figure out how to obtain information about this. There was never any concerted or coordinated attempt with Sheila to try and get information. In fact, at that point, Sheila and I mean, we are distant family in a sense. We're extended family, but this was something that was just taken on to try and gain some information. That kind of grew. Once they filed a lawsuit, there was a protective order in place that didn't allow discovery, and that didn't make me very happy. I thought we needed to get more information as quickly as possible. So I began using the Kansas Open Records Act to try and get what I could. And ultimately, I would pass that on to Sheila or tell her about it. And from there, we kind of just got the ball rolling. Ultimately, I think today I would like to see people understand the limitations of the Kansas Open Records Act. And with those in mind, I think that they can push their legislators, hopefully, or at least let their legislators know that they don't support the Open Records Act in its present form, and that there are certain areas that need some change, and to express that, because certainly there are the bills before the legislature that have come up. They haven't passed as of yet, but I think the more public support we can muster, the better it will be, and the greater opportunity for success.
And Todd, would you be willing to maybe tell us a little bit more about yourself, your organization, and its interest in this, and what you hope to see come out of this conversation?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. My name is Todd Fettig. I'm the executive director with the National Freedom of Information Coalition. We are essentially a coalition of coalitions who are at the state and local levels, who are nonprofit and nonpartisan in nature, and they share an interest in open and transparent government, because they believe an open government is a better government and more responsive to its citizens. So at the national level, we don't so much try to dictate what the priorities are in each state in terms of how they view, what they prioritize in terms of transparency matters. But I can say in the last 2 years, consistently the results from our state coalitions, and there is a Kansas state coalition, consistently the results have been open access to police body cam footage, police misconduct records, and open access to meetings. Because of COVID, that has kind of turned a lot of normal procedures and normal meeting operations kind of on its head. Also created some opportunities. But in this discussion, really, and discussions like this, I really just see as a great way to bring people together and really kind of demand a cultural change around transparency, and just, state that a culture of transparency and an expectation of transparency can, in fact, lead to good things. It's already been stated that these laws, journalists are pretty familiar with them, attorneys and advocates are pretty familiar with these laws, but really they're within the reach of anyone and everyone. And most people, many people don't realize that.
Thank you, Todd. Now turning to Dave, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself, your organization, kind of why you're interested in this issue, and what you hope would come out of our conversation today?
Sure. Well, I'm with Kansas Policy Institute, which is a nonprofit research and education organization, and KPI and our subsidiaries, the Sentinel and Kansas Justice Institute, have submitted hundreds of CORA requests over the years. And we've developed a long list of things that we can help people kind of be on the lookout for and offer some tips. Most of the things that are thrown back, at least at us, have either been, a lot of them have been inaccurate, And I think that comes from a combination of local employees, government employees not understanding KORA, doing what they've been told it says, which often is not true. And of course, sometimes they just don't want to be bothered or give you the information. I will say that we've had much greater success over the years, with a few exceptions recently, on open records requests at the state level. The problems really that we face are at the local level, with schools and cities and counties.
Well, that seems like a good transition to kind of turn back to Sheila. And so I'm interested in kind of the story of your journey into someone looking into local records records at the local level. And that wasn't something you had experience in or training in. Tell us about that. How did you end up being in a place that you're talking about open records with us today?
All right. So thank you also for having all of us. I think this is an incredibly powerful conversation. My background is schools. I was a 25-year public educator. The last 13 of those years, I was a middle school principal in Blue Valley schools. My background, because of teaching, is research. And so the research part of open records requests came pretty naturally. But January 20th of 2018, we lost our oldest son, John, to an officer-involved shooting. He was 17 years old in the middle of a mental health crisis. And the police department, the Overland Park Police Department, came to our home to do a welfare check. And John attempted to leave the home in our family minivan. And as John was pulling out of the garage in a straight line at 2.5 miles per hour, an officer yelled stop as he was firing his gun. 13 shots were fired, 6 of which hit and killed John almost instantaneously. So it put us in a pretty horrific nightmare for the last 4 years. And I think in any tragedy, one of the things that brings a family or a community closure is our answers to questions, because people naturally are going to ask, why did this happen? How did this happen? And I figured out really quickly that the answers weren't going to be forthcoming. I wasn't going to get the officer's name. I wasn't going to find out how many shots were fired. I wasn't going to be able to see any of the forensic evidence related to the investigation. And, while I was kind of in the midst of a dark time, Mark started the open records requests because of his background. And I actually didn't even know he was doing them at the time. We were just we were in survival mode at that point. But as time went on and I started to ask questions, Mark then started to say, well, I've obtained this document, or I've gotten this thing. And I started to read. And that's where, for open records requests to be meaningful, you first have to understand the system that you're working under. So in my case, it was police departments and officer-involved shootings. So we needed to get the manual, the protocol, the policies, standard operating procedures to find out how are these situations handled. And then when you have those documents, then you start asking questions. Well, why can't I see a scene diagram? Why can't I have a copy of the report? Why can't I see all the dash cams? Because Steve Howe released 2 redacted dash cams. He did not release all 4, nor did he release the Ring doorbell cam. And when you start asking those questions, you either get silence or you get, they quote a statute that protects them, saying it's part of a criminal investigation or it's a personnel file. And then you become more and more frustrated. I don't understand why this information isn't available. And that's how I began becoming very familiar with KORA and KORA's limitations. So that's why I would second to what Mark said. It's not just to inspire people today to submit KORA requests and get information that they're entitled to. It's also because We need our core laws to change in Kansas. We are one of the darkest states in the United States. We have some of the worst open records laws, and lack of transparency is bad for business.
I mean, were you, with your background, in education, connected to government, like, were you surprised that it was hard for you to get information, or was it something that you expected going in?
Oh, I was floored because as a principal, I always knew I was a public employee, and therefore anything I did, money we spent, curriculum we used in classrooms, all of those were subject to public scrutiny, as it should be. And I always felt very accountable to the parents that I served and to the families that I worked with, because it was their tax dollars that were keeping the school open and running. So I was completely shocked that the police departments don't operate in that manner. In fact, they are some of the worst when it comes to operating in a transparent manner.
And so clearly you were able to, find a path toward at least some of the information you were looking for. How did you go about making that happen, or what did you learn that made that possible?
It becomes like a puzzle. And I would tell people that are looking to do an open records request, one, your requests do not have to be complicated. My core requests typically are like 3 sentences. Pursuant to Kansas 45-215, please provide me. And then I'd name the document. And then sometimes I get it, sometimes I wouldn't. But then as you collect those documents, you put it together like a puzzle. And I think it's important at that point you work with someone else, even if it's a friend or a family member, but to say, I have this and I have this, but we're still missing this. How do you think we could attain this? And bouncing ideas off of other people to say, well, have we thought about this? Or you know what? If Overland Park won't give us that document, maybe Prairie Village will. And to not give up, to persevere. I give it a really good example. Mark did an open records request years ago for the employment history of the officer who shot and killed my son. You can obtain employment history through what they call Kansas CPost. It's the agency that oversees police departments' licensures. And so Mark obtained Clayton Jennison's employment history, and it showed his last day of work in Overland Park was March 4th, 2018. That document was contradictory to an interview Chief Donchez gave on Fox News February of 2019. He said that Jennison left quickly before any discussions could occur about a reprimand or termination. Well, that open records request, as simple as it was, really calls into question the credibility and the integrity of our own chief of police.
Well, thank you, Sheila. So Mike, Sherry, you wanted to bring this story in the Journal and tell it in the Journal. The Journal is a civic leadership magazine, focuses on people working for the betterment of their communities, tackling tough issues. Why was this a story that belonged in the Journal?
Well, I mean, as someone who has battled with governments as a journalist for 30 plus years, I watched from afar. I mean, I wasn't involved in any journalistic capacity with Sheila's story, but I was watching from afar as she was being so dogged in her open records requests and getting the information. And I was just consuming media stories about it like everybody else. And, so I thought, it was an individual citizen exercising their right under a law that was supposed to be for citizens, not just for journalists and attorneys. And so I thought it was a perfect example for the Journal. And, as I wasn't really a student of the KLC principles as much as I am now, but, when you look at she meets pretty much all the 4 pillars of, and I won't go into them, but I think a couple of them are, one of them talks about intervening skillfully and raising the heat. Well, if there's anything Sheila's good at, it's raising the heat. So that's a core principle of KLC. Don't just stand there, do something. Basically she should be the poster child for KLC's leadership, because she checks every box. And so I think that by her open records advocacy really made her a model for civic leadership.
Well, thank you, Mike. Turning to Mark, so Sheila's already talked about like some of how you were kind of a leading part of this effort to seek out public records on this topic. Could you talk a little bit more about the support or guidance you provided? And I'm just wondering, like, how much of your kind of know-how is necessary to navigate the system?
As far as know-how, I am a retired lawyer, so with my legal background, it isn't hard to read the statute. Now, that said, things that seem to be very simple and straightforward, the wording seems simple and straightforward. You will ultimately find when you submit requests that those who are responding often don't see it in the same way. But I think anyone can take the statute that basically says everything is open, but the key then is to look at the statute that lists the exceptions. And that's where I think people's focus needs to be attentioned. They need to look at that to determine, at least initially in their own mind, whether or not the materials they're seeking can be provided under the statute, or whether the entity that they're seeking records from would have the ability to withhold them. Initially, when I got started, I didn't really know exactly what I would ultimately get. It was basically make the request and see what happened. Again, at the time I got started, Sheila was in the midst of litigation with a stay on discovery. And so I felt like anything that I might be able to obtain and theoretically pass on to them that may be of interest would be of help. And so there were multiple requests made. And I think ultimately those requests gave Sheila a pretty good template as to how to at least start going through this process. She's absolutely right. You just simply have to sit down and think about what you want and how you can best state that. Put it out there, see what they have to say. I think the most frustrating thing ultimately is a denial that doesn't make sense based upon the wording of the statute or the exceptions. We saw that so many times that things would be called personnel records, or Sheila put her finger on another good one, the criminal investigative records. That's another big exception within the statute. Medical and psychiatric records, at least in this particular case, were also problematic. But, ultimately, all you can do is try. And I would just say to anyone, if there are records that you want, you've got to go after them. You can't just sit back and not make the attempt. It's well worth it to make the attempt.
And if you make the attempt and you get a denial, like, to me, it's a little fail forward. Could you phrase it differently to get the answer? Or could you go to another municipality and get the answer? To not just throw your hands in the air and go, oh, yep, that's all right, fine. They said no, game over. I would tell people that to continue to pursue it, just go about it in a different way. I think one of the best examples is when Mark asked for the resignation and any employment agreement between Jennison and the city, and he was denied that. Those records. Eventually, the Star sued the city for those records, and the Star won. And it's an example also of what Dave Traberk said about municipalities not understanding KORA very well, they had no legal ground to deny Mark nor the Star on that. And they were sued and they were lost. And I felt like, sending a little note saying, hey, KORA 101, employment records are subject to open records. They had to learn that the hard way.
The interesting thing about that particular situation was at the outset, we didn't know that there was any type of agreement between Jenison and the city to resign. And by way of their response, it made it clear that there was an agreement. They just weren't going to provide it. And so that's what ultimately led to the fight over the wording of the personnel records exception. But yeah, you never know what you're going to find until you make the attempt.
Well, turning to Dave Trabert from Kansas Policy Institute. So your work is, I imagine, like often in a much different area than what's being addressed by Sheila and Mark. I'm curious, like, could you compare and contrast like your experiences dealing with open records request, and what do you wish people knew about how to make these requests that would, move us in the direction of transparency?
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, we've not gone after criminal issues, but many of the challenges we face when we're asking for kind of economic data, payrolls and other things would apply universally. And so there's a lot of things I think people need to be aware of. I'll start with a reminder to always be professional, no matter how frustrating it gets. You have to really be the adult in the room. Because again, a lot of people think they're doing the right thing, but they don't know. So for example, if they start with an explanation of, well, according to our policy, that's full stop, because no policy can supersede what's in state law. It doesn't matter whether the county commissioners have adopted a policy of what they're going to charge, how they're going to do it, how they want you to submit it. It's irrelevant. And because the only thing that you're really required to provide is your name and a description of what you want. That's it. They cannot make you send it in a written letter. I've seen that tried. A simple email is sufficient. That you don't have to, I've seen, we actually had this happen once, a school district in Johnson County, after they first fought us over whether school payroll information was subject to open records, they tried to give it to us in printed paper format and said we had to come into the office to pick it up and pay in person. We had to take that to the county attorney, who told the school attorney to turn it over and do it quickly. So in and I sent along a sample of what we use. Maybe somebody can put it in the chat room. We have a template we use for every KORA request. And part of it is to say, and we want the data in this format, because and this is something that's not in statute, but it is in the Attorney General's guidance. It says if the entity has the capacity to produce it in like Excel or PDF, searchable PDF, they must do it. And so we push that one a lot. We just say this is how we want it, and to return it. That pricing, we've seen people try to say, they can charge for their costs, but the 25 cents per page is an alternative to calculating costs. It's not additive. They can't say, here's what we charged for our time, and then you have to pay. Now it's one or the other. And now you can only charge, it should be done by the lowest earning person capable of performing the research. So you have to be really careful. I guess one of my favorite examples, we call this the go away price. We submitted an open records request to a university with a purple logo that will remain nameless for copies of any employment agreements they had. They asked for $9,600 so they could hire people to go through their records and see if they had anything responsive to our request. And this is where the turn up the heat applies. We call it the Army form of discipline. We can't make them do it, but we can make them damn sorry they didn't. In that case, a simple phone call to the university president's office said, is this really what you want this news story to be about? And pretty quickly, we got everything we asked for. But it really is important to understand what the laws are, be professional, and be prepared to come back at them with, no, I don't think you're right.
There are clearly, we could make some less generous interpretations about why records are difficult to get, and I'm sure that many of those are very valid. If we were gonna be as generous as possible to local governments in particular, and we started thinking about, well, why isn't it clearer? Why isn't it kind of automatic for some of these requests to be fulfilled? Do you have any thoughts on, why isn't it just more automatic for what's public to be public and what's private to be private?
There's probably not a single answer to that. There are some employees we've talked with, because you're usually starting with whoever they've put in charge of public records. And that's rarely the person who deals with those specific records. And so you sense some frustration because they've not been properly trained. Government employees need to be fully trained on how to respond. We've found in some cases there's fear of raising your head and maybe questioning what your boss told you to do. This is policy. Well, if it's policy, I should follow it. And again, that's where you want to be the adult. It's like, look, I understand that you're doing what you've been told to do. So you've given them permission. It's like, I'm not blaming you, but here are the facts. And so, if it's out of your hands, let's loop in the county commissioners or whoever we need, because we get this data all the time, and we're not going to go away. But there are times when they just don't want to release it. And that's, certainly the things that Sheila dealt with would be one of those circumstances. How they spend money is something that they'd rather keep quiet in some cases. And we deal with that a fair amount.
I think if you're going to be generous with local government on why the information isn't more readily accessible, I do think some of it is the challenge of determining what they're going to, let's say there's information that they could put up on a public website so that people could just get it themselves instead of having to write a core request. The time it takes to determine what do we put up, how do we make sure that the information and the data is current and relevant, who's going to manage that. It's time consuming. It's not an easy task. But there's a police department, Fort Collins, Colorado, who has a transparency and open data portal on their police department's website. It is outstanding. And I think it would make everybody's life better if all police departments operated in that way. But I do think they had commitment from leadership to do it. And they had a really outstanding IT department to make it happen.
If I can jump in there on what it is that various organizations have that lead to some of these problems. And I think some of it, especially when you're talking about city and county governments, the smaller counties, your small towns, they're operating on shoestring budgets and they're overworked and underpaid. Like Dave said, they don't necessarily understand the laws involved. They may not even know where the information's at. And so sometimes they just don't want to deal. And it's understandable, but legally they have to. And we need to figure out a way to make that happen.
Well, Chris, and this is going back to Todd and NFOIC. One of the big pushes among the state coalitions is training for local officials. And, state attorney generals pay lip service to this. You can look at Eric Schmidt's website. You can look at Derek Schmidt's website. They all talk about training of public officials, but what needs to happen is a more robust training regimen, whether it's by the AGs in the states or by NFOIC people, to actually train these county clerks and these people in the backwaters who don't deal with this every day about what the law says and how you comply with it. And if I'm going to be charitable, you know, like Dave said, is many of these folks operate out of ignorance. I don't say that negatively, ignorance of the law, and their knee-jerk reaction is, oh my God, I don't want to give out something I'm not supposed to, and I better charge these people out the wazoo because the statute says I have to, which the statute says they don't have to. So it's basically ignorance as opposed to obstructionism, sometimes, not all the time.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think it based on what I've seen and heard from around the nation, it is primarily ignorance. I'll throw in another bit that I've heard from someone who has had a long history as a records custodian, saying that the way many of these laws are written, it's an unfunded mandate, meaning that it's extra work for local officials to fulfill these requests, or at least that's how it's perceived at some level. And there's probably some grain of truth to that in some ways. Some local governments are more sophisticated than others in terms of IT, as like Sheila pointed out, just with the police department example, that kind of got the gold star. And so it's usually, or it's often not just outright refusal or denial, but it is a lack of training, sometimes a lack of funding, a culture that has maybe dissipated over the years. I believe a part of the problem is the demise or the shrinkage of local journalism in a lot of ways, that there were a lot of people, a lot of feet on the street and people filing requests and making demands of their local and county and state governments. And there's a lot of great work being done in the local journalism space, don't get me wrong, but there aren't as many people to do it. And so that has resulted in just unfamiliarity in some ways with custodians not having to face those requests day in and day out as a matter of course.
I'd like to jump in real quick and push back a little bit on that. I know they say it's an unfunded mandate. It is not. And let's be really clear about that. There is no place where a government budget has a line item for, we need this much money to follow the law. We're expected to follow the law, and so should government, without being paid to do it. And then, by the way, they get reimbursed for their costs. So sure, they might be busy, but there's still plenty of time to do it. And in fact, Kansas is massively overgoverned. If we had if local government employment was at the per capita national average, we'd have about 38,000 fewer local government employees. There's plenty of them out there to do the work, and they'll get reimbursed for it.
Is there any argument to be made that there's also a burden that falls on the public to better know these laws, or is there enough of a system to help the public access them? What's when you think about the people using these laws to get records who aren't journalists, like how much should be on their shoulders to know how to use this law? And I'm curious about that.
There should be better systems in place to help citizens. I think there's a huge burden put on the average person to figure it out. And I'll give you an example. April of last year, Overland Park released part of the officer-involved shooting investigation team report regarding the shooting death of my son. They posted it up on a city website. After my husband and I had a chance to go through it, we noticed there were still huge pieces of information missing from that report, forensic type information, reports that would come from a crime scene investigative unit. And I thought, well, Overland Park says they don't have it. The DA may have it, but they're not giving it to me. Where else would this information be? And so it hit me that it might be at the Johnson County Crime Lab. So I went to the website of the crime lab and looked, how do I make an open records request? Well, the crime lab is part of, I should say, the Johnson County Sheriff's Department's website. And so when I went to that website, it said they would only take an open records request either through mail, like physical US mail, or in person. They would not accept an email request, to Dave's point that they should, but they didn't. So I typed up my request, drove all the way out to Gardner, submitted my request, and then they tried to push the request back at me saying, no, this is something Overland Park has. And I had to push it back at them again and say, no, you have this information here. And so they took their 3 days. And then I got a call and they said, Mrs. Albers, we have the information you want. We can put it on a flash drive. It will be $25 and you will have to come pick it up. I mean, they make it very difficult and confusing for people to access this information. So, you know, it would be easy for someone to say, forget it, I'm done. Like, this is a big pain in the tush. I'm not doing this anymore. But I do think this unrelenting kind of doggedness to get it will force them to now. The sheriff's office will take my core requests on email now. But I have to pay for my request before they give it to me. That has not changed. That's one of my next items to take care of. So if I want some emails, I have to go out there and pay them before they do the research. And then a couple of weeks later, I have to go pick it back up again.
And then do they give a reason for why that is the case? Is it the answer, just that's the policy?
Yes, that's the way we've always done it. So, you know, why would we have to change? And, you know, usually it requires, like what Dave was talking about, somebody making a nasty call saying, hey, you're out of compliance with the law. So if you want to get sued over Cora stuff, then you might want to change your procedures. So, and that's what it's going to take.
Yeah, I'd say, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Dave.
There is, you know, to the extent that citizens need to be aware of the law, it's the easy way to do that would be for every local entity to have a simple page or two bullet points with guidance from the Attorney General's office. You don't want local officials writing it. You want it coming from the Attorney General's office and just put, here's where you ask for it this way, and these are the procedures. That would really go a long way toward helping people understand.
And I'll say from my perspective, maybe it's my history as a teacher, but I think that it should be part of the basic civics that we teach our kids. I think when I was in high school, there was mention of FOIA. I was in Michigan, so of course it wasn't Cora, but there was no training on how you do it, on the steps you go through, on what you can and can't do, anything like that. It just kind of, there's open records out there. You know, it became a little bit more open after Watergate. That's not enough if we want a public that can access this information.
I would like to, this has been a great conversation. I would like to check in with Sam Smith, our communications director. Curious about the chatter on social media. Any comments or questions coming up that you think we should take on with our panelists?
Yeah, can you hear me, Chris?
I can hear you. Good.
Yeah, there's been a lot of good discussion. People that have unfortunately shared experiences. One commenter, Anne-Marie Grant, says that she has a similar story of a public record request, is how her family finally found out the truth about what happened when her brother was killed by the police. Justin says this is happening far too often all across the country. People chiming in, Kansas has some of the most restrictive open record laws in the country. The Kansas Coalition for Open Government is working in Kansas every year to better the law, but we need citizen support for better laws. One question here we might address is, well, maybe respond to, what I would like to know is why the Kansas state legislature passes laws with no input from the public. I'm not sure that everyone would agree with that, but maybe we could respond to what that's coming from. And then also there was a comment here about how how Kansas became such a dark state when it comes to open records. Has it always been that way, or there are laws more recent developments? And then someone responded that it has been that way for a long time, but maybe that's something that some of the experts here could address.
You know, with regard to the idea of the public's input, bills go through the process every year, and there is an opportunity for people to make their wishes known to their legislators or to potentially even testify. What often happens specifically with regard to the KORA provisions as it relates to criminal investigative records, for example, or disciplinary records of police officers, the police lobby, the law enforcement lobby is very strong. And that is a huge hurdle to overcome. The legislators place a lot of stock in what those folks have to think. And, you know, just as an example, with regard to criminal investigative records, the idea has been, why not release those investigative records that are closed? A file has been closed. It's over, it's done with, the trial is done, there's nothing else going on, there's no new investigation. Why should that not be available to the public? Well, you get a variety of excuses, and one of the favorite ones is, well, we're going to be giving up our secret investigative techniques. And it was just so amusing that when the city of Overland Park finally released the OSIT report in Sheila's case, or in John's case, there certainly were no secret criminal investigative techniques there. I mean, you would get more off of NCIS on TV than you would looking at a file like that. So, you know, I just think that the public really has to become more directly involved and let their legislators know that there are differing opinions, that the law enforcement lobby should not have the final say with regard to all of these things.
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, back to turn up the heat and getting involved. Every time someone has a problem with getting open records, write to your state rep and your state senator, tell them about the issue and close it with a simple question. Will you introduce legislation to fix this? What happens is when someone like this year, the Press Association proposed some changes to KORA that should have taken place. The excuse for not doing anything is, well, I'm hearing from my cities and counties that they don't say this is necessary, and I don't hear anything from constituents. You need to, you know, send an email every time, and if maybe do both. Phone calls when they're in session. There's no one there to answer the phone otherwise, but keep them posted and let them know what's going on.
Part of the question was kind of about the historical aspect of it and how it's developed. This way, I was actually trying to find the article with the study in it, but there was a study I read a few years ago when I was doing my research for my master's that showed a direct correlation between the more single party a state was, also the less media that state had, the darker that state got. It's the more we're pushing and pulling, the more we're demanding and requiring that openness, the more open the records tend to be. And it doesn't matter if it's a Democratic state, a state that's dominated by Democrats, or a state that's dominated by Republicans. If it's dominated by one party, it tends to go darker.
Well, and that kind of goes, government is inherently secretive, you know, you know, you can't blame, you know, the Tea Party or whoever it is. I mean, it happens under Democrats, it happens under Republicans. And you have to pry information. It is not a partisan issue. I mean, maybe Dave can speak to that since he's tried with both Republican and Democratic administrations, but I don't think it's not one or the other, from what I can tell.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we've had, as I said, we've had good relations generally with state government. whether it was a Democrat or a Republican in the governor's office. And we don't know the political affiliation of local employees, but it doesn't matter. We've had it happen in blue counties as well as red counties. Good and bad.
I'll just say ditto, same thing.
Thank you for this is a really interesting line of inquiry. Sam, I hear you have one other comment that you'd like to share.
Yeah, I just thought that our panelists would enjoy hearing that Josiah Dalbini has just said, as a current city councilman, this has inspired me to look into our current practices at the city regarding Coracoma. So I think that's a nice outcome I wanted to share.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, and that sort of leads me to a question that's on my mind. So like the idealist in me would want to think that people on multiple sides of this issue see a need for people to feel connected to their government, to have that government be accountable. Like that's part of being in a democracy, that the government responds to the people. And I think if you ask people on the street if they agreed with that concept, most people would I don't think anybody would disagree with it. But when you get into like the details of living that out, like that's when like the disagreement comes about. And I wonder, like maybe for each of our panelists to conclude, like what hopes do you see for like inspiring a collective purpose among government officials to embrace like transparency and for the public to embrace knowledge? And are there possibilities there? Or is this just always going to be kind of a little bit of a conflictual thing, that part of the issue is just, there's always going to be a little battle of information? I'm curious, like, where are you on the, optimists for inspire a collective purpose versus this is going to kind of be a hard fight in the years to come that's going to keep coming up? Or you have a third perspective? I'm curious where you stand on this.
I think anything involving a controversy is going to be a hard road to go. I mean, that's fairly typical. I mean, anything to do with potential litigation or something that might catch the local folks with their pants down is always going to be a fight. But I will say I have to some degree compliment Overland Park, for example. Prior to getting into the requests for some of the specific materials with regard to the Albers shooting, I made some requests with regard to mental health issues. They were very responsive. So, it just seemed to me that it all depended upon the nature of the request. If they didn't feel threatened by it, great. We'll even give it to you free, great deal. But that, to me, it seems to be the dividing line.
I would definitely agree. I consider myself an optimistic pessimist. I don't necessarily think things are going to change dramatically, but I think there is hope for some change, in particular because I see our younger generations being more politically in tune. They're paying attention in a way that my generation just did not. And when they pay attention, governments become more responsive. And so I do see some hope there. At the same time, again, anytime they think they're going to get smacked in the face, they're going to walk away with some mud on their face, they are going to fight it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it is encouraging that we're seeing, for a lot of different reasons the last couple of years, we're seeing a lot of parents and grandparents and other folks getting involved and asking questions. And that prompts people to look for help to get the records. And I think success helps a great deal. I think what Sheila accomplished here is an inspiration and shows that it can be done. There's the fact that we're having this conversation and informing, a lot of it is just not knowing that there's a problem. We don't know what we don't know. So I think as word gets out of more of these successes, that people are going to be inspired. And in order to be successful, we have to be smart about it too. Don't go on fishing expeditions. You can make multiple requests. You can ask for one. Oftentimes, asking for a piece of information will lead us to ask for another one. But the more you ask them to do up front, the more likely you're going to be unsuccessful. Just be smart. Help them know what you're doing. Do everything in writing, so there's a paper trail. And if you're not getting something, you can short circuit that process by saying, please provide this answer no later than. That signals to a lot of them, especially to their attorneys, that, oh, you might be preparing to go to the county attorney with this. Be smart about it, and you're going to increase your success rate.
I agree with the statements about that. If there is any chance that there's going to be a negative repercussion, there's going to be a fight. And I consider myself a huge optimist in that I always look for ways for things to move forward in a positive way. I think it really comes down to leadership within a particular organization, because I've had conversations with police chiefs and DAs in other areas who are adamant about being transparent with their public. They see the advantage to putting more information out there, that it builds trust, it creates engagement. They see the positives in getting that information out there. I have open record requested the protocol manual used in OSIT investigations. Mark has too. I have multiple copies of it. I have the MOU that governs OSIT investigations. Both those documents should be on a public website for the public to access at any time. It's not private information. It's not confidential information. I have repeatedly asked our district attorney to put that up on his website, and I literally don't get a response from him. Not even a thanks for your info, we're considering it. And it's because there's just not the buy-in from that leader on how important transparency is. And that is completely opposite from a DA out in Larimer County, Colorado, who has everything regarding their officer involved shooting information right up there on their public website. And it's amazing. And I think that the community appreciates that. They're like, wow, they're being open with us. I don't have to call them with questions because everything is right here. And that's what I want to push our local governments to do more of. Put more of it on the public website, give the public easy access to this information so that they then can have input in on these processes that impact everybody.
Todd, Mike.
I have some optimism. I do have some optimism that with the advances in technology, and with the advocacy that we're seeing, the interest that we're seeing among youth, that there are opportunities here, and with examples of good outcomes, as we've talked about with the work that Sheila has done, and some good leadership in some locations. It can be held, we can point to examples where this works, where this informs the public, engages the public. Every year, the NFOIC gives an award to heroes of the state. And I'm going to borrow a line from one of our recent recipients, who's very active in Wisconsin and transparency laws in Wisconsin. And his advice to local officials is try transparency, you'll like it. It fosters a more engaged community, better results, better informed laws and ordinances, policies.
I mean, my thought is, I mean, as someone who's battled against government for 30 plus years, I mean, journalists, there's a fine line between being skeptical and cynical, and I try not to cross the line, but I'm skeptical that we're going to see an improvement. I mean, one thing that I would like to talk about it, rather than, I mean, and I told Sheila this, I mean, one thing, rather than trying to block other, exemptions from being added, what I'd like to see is, I mean, I would consider it a success if we went up there and got one exemption taken out of of CORA, to me, that's worth more than 100 gallons of ink in a barrel. I mean, if I could get one onerous, or have this, have citizens rise up and get one onerous exemption taken out of KORA, that to me would be a huge success.
Agreed.
Well, it's, you know, it's clear from these discussions that this, you know, this issue isn't going away, and we're going to keep talking about it, discussing it at the Journal. Thank you specifically to Sheila for talking about this issue, for sharing your story with the Journal. Thank you, Mike, for telling it. Thank you to our panelists for joining us and having this robust discussion about open records. I will be interested to see reactions to this discussion, what happens in this issue in the years to come, and I'm grateful for your time, and thank you to our audience for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation and that this is one that will stick with you for a while. So thank you again to our panelists and Sheila, and until next time, this is it for this month's edition of Journal Live.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.